For over 3,000 years, the River Nile was the longest river in the world. And for most of that time, it was also the largest river in the world. Even today, it's the longest river on the planet, only recently being overtaken by the Amazon as the largest. But size isn't everything. The Nile has shaped human history like no other. A single ruler couldn't control its floods, but an empire could. Harnessing the power of the river made ancient Egypt one of the richest civilizations in the ancient world, and we think we know how they did it. Hi, it's me, and this is our channel. Today we're uncovering secrets of the Nile. Let's get to it. In the 19th century, European scientists thought they had figured out why ancient Egypt flourished along the River Nile while the rest of North Africa remained so barren. They believed that the Nile had once flowed into the Mediterranean, creating a large lake that would later evaporate, leaving behind mineral deposits that fertilized the soil around the river. This theory seemed to check out because other salty lakes like the Dead Sea were full of minerals, and modern-day Egypt was pretty salty. However, after discovering that much of Egypt's soil was actually sandy, scientists realized that there was another explanation for the fertile soil. It came from the river itself. Every year, the Nile would flood, covering the fields in silt and mud, which washed away when the water receded, leaving behind rich deposits that helped plants grow. The Egyptians noticed these cycles long ago. Each year, the Nile would rise in the summer, flooding the fields and destroying crops. Then it would retreat, leaving behind mud and seeds. By planting new crops in the mud, they could harvest twice per year. Without the yearly flooding, the soil would become infertile. With it, they became one of the first societies to farm successfully. But the Nile wasn't always so predictable. In 2004, researchers discovered evidence that around 3,000 years ago, the Nile flooded unpredictably. They used radiocarbon dating to analyze plant pollen and sediment samples collected from Lake Karun, an ancient lake connected to the Nile River. They found that 4,000 years ago, the lake levels rose rapidly, then fell quickly. The deposits left behind showed a sudden increase in erosion, meaning something had caused the Nile to flood unexpectedly. But at the time, there were no dams along the river. So what could have caused such a sudden increase? Some researchers believe that every 7 to 10 years, the river would flood, eroding vast amounts of soil and depositing them in the Mediterranean. But the discovery of these floods didn't bring all the answers. For example, if the floods only occurred every 7 to 10 years, why did farmers plant 2 harvests each year? If their crops were constantly being washed away, they probably wouldn't have been able to survive. So are there other secrets buried along the banks of the Nile? Many scientists think so. There are some things that we don't understand about ancient Egypt, like how they built their pyramids or who ruled during the first dynasty. But the geography of the region provides clues that can help us unlock these mysteries. For example, the people who settled along the Nile weren't the first to benefit from its yearly floods. The Neolithic Naqada culture thrived in Egypt between 4000 and 3000 BCE. They lived in small villages and farmed along the river, raising cattle and sheep and growing crops like wheat and barley. Their settlements were located where the river flooded the most, making them easy targets for larger groups looking for new land. In fact, most major cities in Egypt were built in this same location until the Arab conquest in the 7th century CE. But the Nile wasn't always so predictable. Some years the river flooded too much, destroying homes and crops. Other years it didn't flood at all. This is when the secret of the Nile revealed itself to the Egyptians, something that we've been uncovering for centuries. The Nile's floods were controlled by the seasons, specifically the annual flooding of the Mediterranean. Every year, winds shifted patterns, bringing moist air from the south. As the air traveled north, it collided with dry air coming from the Sahara. This created a low-pressure zone in the northeast near Alexandria, causing moist air to flow into the Mediterranean and flood the Nile. When the Mediterranean flooded, the Nile would swell, spilling over its banks and fertilizing the Egyptian lands. Then the Mediterranean would recede, leaving the Nile to nourish the farms before the cycle started again. But the Nile doesn't just depend on the Mediterranean. Rainfall plays a key role too. During the rainy season, October through May, rainfall in Ethiopia and Eritrea flows through the Blue Nile into Lake Victoria, which feeds the White Nile. The White Nile then flows northward through Sudan, eventually joining the Atbara River to form the Nile Delta at the Egyptian border. The combined waters continue northward, nourishing the Egyptian landscape until it reaches the Mediterranean. However, not everyone benefits from the Nile's annual floods. Just ask the Nubian people, whose lands were destroyed when Egypt built the Aswan High Dam in 1964. The dam regulates the Nile's water flow and prevents deadly floods, but it also stopped the southern part of the river from overflowing, killing off the vegetation and turning the area into a desert. That's why many of the ancient Nubian villages are now underwater, submerged by the man-made Lake Nasser. But let's return to the ancient Egyptians. They, too, built irrigation systems to control the flow of the river. These allowed them to water crops during the dry season, giving them continuous access to food. But without these networks, their farms depended on the yearly floods. If the floods failed one year, the crops failed the next. Controlling the Nile's floods became a matter of life and death. That's why the Egyptians worshipped the Nile as a god. Hapi was the personification of the river, often depicted as a man with green skin, symbolizing the fertile landscape the river created. During the annual flooding season, the Egyptians celebrated the rising of the Nile with a festival honoring Hapi. But controlling the river required more than just prayers to a fertility god. It took careful planning. Unfortunately, we don't know much about how the Egyptians controlled the Nile. Our best guess comes from studying the remains of irrigation systems left behind by ancient civilizations. When the river flooded, the Egyptians used canals and basins to divert the water onto their fields. But during the dry season, they needed a way to deliver the water back to the river without wasting precious resources. We think they used shadufs, a type of crane used to lift water from the ground, and qanats, underground channels used to transport water over long distances. These networks allowed the Egyptians to water crops even when the Nile wasn't overflowing. And it wasn't just the predictability of the Nile that helped ancient Egypt flourish. The river provided the perfect conditions for papyrus to grow, a type of wetland plant that the Egyptians used to make paper. They cut down the reeds and soaked them in water until they became soft. Then they beat the reeds into thin sheets and dried them in the sun, creating a lightweight material that was ideal for writing. They would draw pictures and write in black ink, made from a mixture of soot and water. This invention led to a paper manufacturing industry along the Nile with entire villages dedicated to the process. The paper made from papyrus transformed Egyptian society. Writing became easier, allowing scribes to record important information and pass down history. It also helped the government keep track of taxes and manage the kingdom. But it wasn't just paper that sprung up along the Nile. Another staple of the Egyptian economy grew from the river as well, their famous flax. The Egyptians grew flax along the riverbanks, then used the strong fibers to make linen. They used this breathable fabric for everything from bandages to burial wrappings. But linen and paper weren't the only industries that the river helped create. The papyrus plants that grew along the Nile were so plentiful that the Egyptians used them to make boats. Using reeds and papyrus, they created light, narrow vessels that were perfect for navigating the river. These boats allowed the Egyptians to trade goods throughout the river system and connect the northern and southern parts of the kingdom. It also helped unify the country, fostering communication between different regions. And the river wasn't just a source of valuable resources, it also protected ancient Egypt from invaders. To reach the kingdom, you had to cross the river, making it easy to defend. The Egyptians built fortresses along the Nile, turning the river into a barrier against outside forces. The river's unpredictable nature meant that a massive invasion force could be spotted long before reaching Egyptian borders. This gave the Egyptian rulers time to prepare their defenses, safeguarding their civilization. It seems that ancient Egypt truly was a gift of the Nile. From its annual floods to the papyrus growing along its banks, the river played a critical role in the kingdom's success. The Nile gave them fertile land to farm, papyrus to make paper and boats, flax for linen and protection from invaders. In return, the Egyptians worshipped the river as a god, building irrigation systems to ensure its water nourished their crops. So what secrets of the Nile remain hidden? As we continue to explore the river and uncover more of ancient Egypt's history, we may discover more ways that the Nile shaped one of the world's greatest civilizations. Thanks for watching. What are your thoughts about ancient Egypt? Let us know in the comments below. And be sure to subscribe for more videos. See you next time.